Hello, my name is John and welcome back to A Long Look. Today we're turning our attention to one of the most dramatic and decisive aspects of medieval power, siege warfare. Castles weren't built just to impress, they were built to withstand war, and from the 11th to the 15th century they did exactly that, over and over again. So with that out of the way, let's begin. Siege warfare didn't begin with medieval castles. In fact, it is one of the oldest forms of organised conflict in human history. As far back as 2500 BC, ancient Egyptian reliefs show soldiers attacking fortified towns with siege ladders, battering rams, and protective shields. The Sumerians, the Assyrians, and later the Romans all developed sophisticated methods for storming walled cities. Wherever humans built walls to protect themselves, someone else began inventing ways to bring those walls down. By the medieval period, this ancient craft had evolved into a complex art, and castles were its primary stage. Although Hollywood loves to show great cavalry charges and armoured armies clashing on open fields, the truth is that medieval warfare was overwhelmingly siege warfare. Historians estimate that up to 90% of military operations involved besieging, defending, blockading, or threatening fortified places. Why is this? Well, there are a variety of reasons. The first, castles controlled everything. Castles were far more than military fortresses. They were instruments of power, administration, and domination. A single strong castle could oversee and control every aspect of a region. They controlled trade routes, from monitoring merchants, exacting tolls, and preventing rival armies from moving supplies. Valleys and river crossings, from checkpoints where armies or caravans could be delayed or intercepted. Farmland, ensuring steady food supplies for both garrison and local population. Law courts, from administrating justice, enforcing the Lord's will, and resolving disputes among tenants. Taxation, from collecting rents, tithes, and tolls to fund both the castle and its overlord. And the surrounding population, projecting authority, enforcing loyalty, and deterring rebellion. To dominate a region, you had to control its castle. Overlooking even one could be fatal. A neglected fortress could harass supply lines, raid villages, or strike unexpectedly behind an army, turning strategy into chaos. Castles were not just strategic structures, they were the backbone of medieval power, both military and civil. The second reason is that battles were just too risky. Open battles were unpredictable and deadly. One misjudged charge, a failed flank, or a sudden ambush could wipe out an entire noble family's power, leaving lands leaderless and vassals vulnerable. Knights owed only limited service, often bound by seasonal campaigns or feudal obligations, and mercenaries were costly, both in pay and in political fallout of failure. A siege, by contrast, shifted the risk away from individual heroics. Commanders could control the tempo, choose when to attack or retreat, and apply steady pressure over weeks or even months. It allowed armies to leverage engineering, logistics, and patience rather than pure luck or valor. Every stone thrown, every tunnel dug, and every rationed meal was a calculated move. Victory could be earned through endurance rather than a single chaotic clash. In essence, a siege was not just a battle, it was a strategic war of attrition, and castles with their thick walls, layered defences, and ingenious design were built to test that strategy to its absolute limit. The third reason would be castles' forced strategic choices. Once the encirclement was complete, the real siege began. Attackers rarely rushed in. Instead, they applied consistent pressure to break the defenders long before any final assault. Siege warfare unfolded in phases. Isolation, by cutting roads, diverting streams, and controlling nearby farms. Psychological pressure, by displaying siege engines, shouting terms of surrender, or parading prisoners to undermine morale. Routine bombardment, by catapults, trebuchets, and later bombardments fired day and night to wear down walls and defender nerves. Mining and counter-mining. Sappers dug tunnels to collapse towers, while defenders listened for vibrations and dug their own intercept tunnels. Probing attacks, where small-scale assaults tested weak points, such as gatehouses, or undermined sections. And, of course, attrition, such as disease, hunger, and exhaustion. These often did more damage than weapons. Most sieges didn't end with heroic last stands. They ended when one side could no longer endure the strain. Castles were designed to stretch out that suffering for as long as possible, forcing besiegers to bleed time, manpower, and resources on their stone walls. The first step of besieging a castle would be choosing the approach. Once attackers identified the castle's vulnerable angles, defenders countered with layered strategies designed to prolong survival and exhaust the besieging force. Garrisons prepared for months, sometimes even years, of isolation. Their priorities were clear: water security. Wells were placed deep inside keeps or courtyards so attackers couldn't poison or cut them off. Food stores with salted meat, grain, dried fish, and hard cheese filled with granaries and undercrofts. Some castles kept livestock inside the walls. Ammunition such as stone shot, javelins, bolts, and repair timber were stockpiled long before any threat appeared. Fire control, such as sand, wet hides, and clay, were kept ready to smoulder any incendiary attack. Inner redoubts, even if outer walls fell. Keeps, gatehouses, and towers functioned as fallback positions. And of course, communication. Beacon points and arrow loops were positioned to send signals and maintain contact with allies. Defenders used every advantage of height, structure, and preparation. Castles were not passive buildings. They were engineered to buy time, force attrition, and make any attacker pay heavily for every meter gained. The second step would be establishing the siege lines. Once an attacking army selected the direction of assault and positioned its engineers, the next step was to lock the castle into a cage of earthworks and timber fortifications. Medieval commanders did this by constructing 2 rings of siege lines, each serving a different purpose. The inner line, also known as the contravallation, this line faced inwards toward the castle. It usually consisted of earthen banks, timber palisades, trenches, and firing platforms. Its purpose was simple but essential: to stop defenders from breaking out. During sieges, garrisons often launched sudden night sorties, burning siege engines or killing engineers. The contravallation line acted as a barrier, a miniature fortress encircling the main fortress. Then there was the outer line, the circumvallation. This line faced outwards towards the countryside. Its purpose was the opposite: to block reinforcements from reaching the castle, intercept supply caravans, prevent messages from escaping, and keep local peasants and militias from harassing the besiegers. In effect, the besieging army turned itself into a fortified camp city, complete with ditches, towers, and patrols. The purpose of both lines together, with the contravallation and the circumvallation built, the castle was completely isolated. This prevented defenders from escaping. No breakout attempts, no sudden sallies, no midnight raids on siege engines. Reinforcements arriving, allies couldn't break through the outer ring, attackers always knew where an enemy army would have to strike. And, of course, supplies from being smuggled in was prevented. So no food, no fresh troops, no messages. Starvation and isolation were just as deadly as any trebuchet. Commanders like Julius Caesar used this technique masterfully at Alesia in 52 BC, building over 14 miles of dual fortifications, a method inherited much later by medieval armies. By the High Middle Ages, contravallation and circumvallation had become standard for long sieges. This allowed a besieging force to survive for weeks or months while slowly squeezing the life out of defenders. The third step is, of course, logistics. A medieval siege wasn't just a battle, it was a fully functioning temporary city, built and managed under extreme pressure. The success of the operation often depended as much on organisation and supply as on weapons or bravery. A siege army could range from a few thousand to over 12,000 people, all of whom needed food, water, shelter, and constant coordination. That meant armies required specialists of every kind: blacksmiths to repair swords, armour and siege engine fittings, carpenters to build towers, ramps and bridges, foragers to gather firewood, fodder and fresh food, cooks to feed hundreds or thousands with basic but sustaining meals, surgeons to tend to wounds from arrows, rocks and melee, priests to maintain morale and perform last rites when needed, sappers and engineers to dig tunnels, construct battering rams, or design siege engines, and of course the mercenary specialists for unique skills such as crossbow experts, siege tower crews, or siege engine operations. Everything had to be coordinated like clockwork. Siege camps were laid out with street, guard posts, storehouses, and even latrines. Orders flowed from the commander down through captains, and a breakdown in any part of the system could doom the entire operation. A single mismanaged food supply or poorly constructed ramp could allow defenders to repel attackers. This meticulous organisation was the inverse of castle life. While the fortress relied on thick walls, towers, and design ingenuity to survive, attackers relied on planning, engineering skill, and endurance to bring it down. And when the castle finally fell, it was often because of the slow, grinding siege machinery rather than a sudden battle. With walls, moats, and murder holes holding defenders in, the garrison had only one job: endure. Starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment were the real enemies, and holding out required discipline, rationing, and ingenuity, sometimes for months at a time. A castle's strength began long before the first stone was laid. It began with the high ground and line of sight. Medieval castles were almost never placed at random. The location was chosen with military precision, turning the surrounding landscape into part of the fortress. Strategic placements allowed defenders to see an army days before it arrived. Hilltops, ridgelines, and coastal promontories provided vast visibility, letting garrisons track dust clouds, marching formations, or approaching fleets long before the enemy reached striking distance. Allowed observation of camp construction and troop movements. From a high curtain wall or watchtower, a soldier could watch the enemy set up tents, dig trenches, and begin assembling siege engines. Every hammer strike or timber frame gave away the attacker's intentions. The identity of siege engine assembly, such as trebuchets, battering rams, and towers, required huge amounts of timber and time. Castles placed on high cliffs or steep hills could see these preparations clearly, often allowing defenders to strike early with archers or fire arrows. It allowed them to signal allies or neighbouring fortresses. Many castles were part of a wider defensive network, using beacon fires, smoke signals, banners, or riders. They could call for reinforcements from miles away. In regions like Wales and the Scottish borders, castles formed chains of communication. It also allowed them to monitor key supply routes. Castles were frequently built overlooking trade roads, river crossings, mountain passes, or harbours. This allowed lords to tax goods, control movements, and intercept enemy supplies. And on the battlefield, high-positioned archers and crossbowmen dominated open ground. From elevated platforms, even a small garrison could hold back hundreds. Arrows flew further from height, and crossbow bolts hit with even more force when fired downhill. Open plains or river valleys beneath the castle effectively became killing zones. A well-placed castle wasn't just defending itself, it controlled the entire landscape around it. The defensive architecture of the castle came alive when it was threatened, with arrow loops and crossbow slits. Castle designers understood geometry just as well as any military engineer today. Arrow loops, the narrow vertical slits in castle walls as shown here, were carefully angled masterpieces of defense. From the outside, they looked like razor-thin slits almost impossible to shoot into, and from the inside, they widened dramatically, giving the defenders a broad field of fire. This meant defenders could fire left, right, and downward across huge arcs. Attackers, even with longbows, had no clear shot back in. Crossbowmen inside the castle could reload in safety, step forward, and shoot without exposing themselves. A single, well-placed arrow loop could cover an entire approach, gatehouse, or drawbridge. Architects often combine them with sloped sills, deep recesses, and angled embrasures, turning a simple slit into a precision-engineered firing position. It was asymmetrical warfare built into stone. Every angle favoured the defender. When attackers reached the base of a castle wall, they entered one of the most dangerous zones of the battlefield, the foot of the curtain wall. Defenders positioned above could unleash deadly rain of missiles through battlements, murder holes, and machicolations. Contrary to popular myth, boiling oil was almost never used. It was too valuable, too flammable, and far too dangerous to handle in a wooden fighting platform. Also too expensive. Instead, castles relied on far more practical weapons. They dropped or hurdled rocks and boulders, such as simple, heavy, devastating stone, from a parapet, which could crush several men at once or smash a ladder. They used hot sand or heated pebbles, which slid under armoured joints, burning the skin and forcing attackers to drop shields or flee. Javelins and throwing spears could be cheaply produced, easy to reuse, and effective against tightly packed troops. Crossbow and bolts and arrows fired from protected positions behind crenellations and arrow loops. They were the steady, constant killers in the siege. And quicklime, a powder that burned when it hit moisture, including eyes and lungs. It could blind or incapacitate an entire wave of attackers when scattered from above. All of these were practical, plentiful, and of course deadly. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to disrupt the assault, break momentum, and force the enemy to hesitate just long enough for defenders to regroup or launch a counterattack. Many great castles weren't defended by a single wall, but multiple layered rings of fortification called concentric walls. This design wasn't just about strength, it was about control. If attackers managed to breach the outer wall, they didn't suddenly win. Instead, they entered a carefully engineered trap. The second line of defence, usually the inner bailey or the upper ward, turned the courtyard into a killing ground. From higher inner walls and towers, defenders could rain arrows, javelins, stones, and crossbow bolts directly into the exposed attackers, now milling in the open space below. The slope of the ground offered favour to the defenders, giving them a clear view of every movement inside the outer perimeter. And crucially, the inner line was never improvised. Castles were built with the assumption that the outer defences might fall. Fallback positions were prepared in advance, reinforced gates, elevated firing platforms, secure stairways, and reserve garrisons ready to hold the upper ward. Even if the enemy captured the outer bailey, they found themselves exhausted, disorganised, and immediately under a storm of missile fire, while the defenders retreated to an even stronger position. This layered defence philosophy is what made a place like Crac de Chevalier, Chateau Gillard, and Carcassonne so formidable. A breach wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of the next deadly phase of the defence. Popular imagination paints castle moats as wide, sparkling blue lakes. The reality was far more practical and far more unpleasant. Most medieval moats were muddy, stagnant ditches filled with foul water, silt, rubbish, and whatever else accumulated over years of use. Some were simply dry ditches, carved deep and steep enough to trap attackers. Others were tidal, fed by nearby rivers or marshes, turning into thick, sucking bogs when the water receded. But despite the lack of fairy tale glamour, moats were brutally effective defensive tools. A well-designed moat stopped siege towers dead in their tracks. The enormous wheeled structures couldn't get close enough to the walls to be effective. Moats also made mining extremely difficult. Wet ground collapsed, flooded tunnels, and prevented sappers from reaching the foundations. Infantry were slowed to a crawl, bogged down in mud or forced to navigate narrow causeways under heavy missile fire. And above all, moats controlled movement. Attackers were channeled into designated kill zones, narrow points where defenders could concentrate arrows, crossbow bolts, rocks, and boiling water with devastating precision. A moat didn't need to be beautiful, it only needed to be the hell for anyone trying to cross it. Most sieges were not won by attacking. They were lost by starvation, thirst, disease, morale collapse, leadership failure, and treachery. A well-stocked castle could hold out for months, even years. Now we cover the heart of siege warfare, the weapons and the techniques. Mining and sapping. One of the deadliest and often least understood siege tactics from the medieval world was mining and sapping. Long before gunpowder, this was the most reliable way to bring down a wall that refused to yield. Attackers would dig tunnels beneath a targeted section of the fortification, shoring the passage with timber beams behind them. Once the tunnel reached the ideal point, they packed it with combustible materials such as dry wood, pitch, fat, even sulphur, and set it alight. When the supports burned through, the tunnel roof collapsed, taking the foundation with it. Entire stretches of curtain wall could buckle outward in seconds. The method reached grim perfection at Rochester Castle in 1215, when King John's engineers used miners, pigs, and fat to fuel a fire so intense it caused the great southeast tower to shear off and fall. Chronicles described the defenders watching in horror as the ground beneath them gave way. But strong castles didn't simply accept their fate. Many built countermines, defensive tunnels designed to intercept energy sappers underground. These dark, narrow passages required teams of engineers, skilled diggers, ventilation shafts for air, and listening posts where men pressed their ears to the air, waiting for the faint scrape of enemy tools. Battles fought in these cramped spaces were brutal, desperate, and often fought by torchlight. Archaeology has confirmed the scale of this underground warfare. Excavations at castles across Britain and Europe show collapsed curtain walls, burned layers, and the remains of tunnels, silent proof of a tactic that quite literally undermined the strongest fortresses of the medieval age. The trebuchet, the superweapon of medieval warfare. A trebuchet used a massive counterweight to hurl stones weighing 100 to 300 kilograms over extraordinary distances of 2 to 300 meters. They could pulverize walls, smash towers, or simply hurl rotten animal carcasses to spread disease and fear and incendiaries. They required teams of engineers and dozens of men. Some were so formidable they gained infamy through their destructive ability. The Wolf War trebuchet was built during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 by King Edward I of England. It was one of the largest trebuchets ever built, with a throwing arm of over 50 feet long and capable of hurling boulders weighing up to 300 pounds. The trebuchet was so powerful that it was said to have caused a section of the castle wall to collapse after just 3 shots. The Warwolf trebuchet became famous for its destructive power and was instrumental in the English capture of Stirling Castle. The Bad Neighbour trebuchet was used during the siege of Carcassonne in 1240. This massive machine was capable of launching stones weighing up to 300 pounds and had a range over 1,000 feet. The Bad Neighbour trebuchet was so named because it was said to have been built so close to the city walls that it was practically a neighbour to the defenders. Despite this, the trebuchet was able to breach the walls of Carcassonne and helped end the siege. Others included the Hibernian trebuchet, God's Stone's Thrower, and the Dominia Gunilda. Before we dive deeper into siege engines, we need to clear up a few persistent misunderstandings, especially around the mangonel, the onager, and the ballista. These words are often used interchangeably today, but in medieval and ancient warfare, they meant very different things. The term mangonel comes from the Latin mangonum, meaning engine of war. But here's the trick. In the medieval ages, mangonel wasn't a specific machine. It was a catch-all term, used for stone throwing in general, most commonly referring to the traction trebuchet, a machine powered not by twisted ropes, but by teams of men pulling on ropes to swing the arm forward. These were fast to assemble, relatively light, and perfect for rapid deployment in medieval sieges. This type of mangonel is the one the Normans brought to England in 1066. It was often flat-packed. The onager, however, was something completely different. The name comes from the Greek onagra, meaning wild ass. Because the recoil of the machine was so violent, the Roman engineers compared it to being kicked by one. The onager was a Roman torsion catapult powered by twisted skins of sinew or hair. It held medium-sized stones used in stored torsion energy, an ingenious ancient design, but one that did not survive into the medieval West. By the early Middle Ages, torsion technology had largely disappeared, replaced by the easier-to-build traction trebuchets, the medieval mangonels. And the ballista occupies a third category entirely. Rather than throwing stones in an arc, the ballista was essentially a massive torsion-powered crossbow, firing bolts or small stones with exceptional accuracy. It was used heavily in the Roman world and survived into Byzantine warfare, but was far less common in Western Europe by the high medieval period. The battering rams were heavy tree trunks, often iron-capped, suspended under a protective wooden or tortoise roof. A team of men swung it back and forth to smash gates or crack weakened wall sections. The Assyrians used rams as early as 850 BC, and medieval engineers perfected the design with wheels, wet hides for fire protection, and shock-absorbing ropes. At the 1216 siege of Dover, rams were used continuously for days to weaken the Barbican gates. Siege towers were giant rolling wooden towers, sometimes as tall as the castle walls. They allowed attackers to cross from tower to battlements on a bridge and fight hand-to-hand on equal ground. The Romans used them at Masada in AD 73, and medieval armies continued the tradition. At the siege of Kenilworth in 1266, the royal army constructed enormous towers covered in wet ox hides to resist fire arrows. Vulnerable to fire, ditches, and counter-attacks, siege towers could be vulnerable but effective. By the early 14th century, a quiet revolution began rumbling across Europe, one that would eventually shatter the age of medieval castles: gunpowder. At first a mysterious import from the East, it slowly found its way into European arsenals. The earliest weapons hardly looked threatening. They were crude, handheld guns, little more than metal tubes. The pot de feu, a vase-shaped cannon that belched iron bolts, and small bombards capable of lobbing stone shot with an unpredictable, thunderous force. But even these primitive weapons carried something far more dangerous than fire and noise. They carried potential. They struck walls with a new kind of power, a blunt, concussive force no traditional siege engine could match. At first, they chipped and cracked stone. Then, as metallurgy improved and cannons grew heavier, those cracks became fractures, and fractures became breaches. Castle architects watched nervously as the battlefield changed. Their towering curtain walls, once symbols of invincibility, were suddenly liabilities. High walls made perfect targets. Vertical faces crumbled under sustained bombardment, and so a new response began to emerge. Castles thickened their lower walls, spreading them outward into massive sloped foundations designed to absorb cannon fire. Towers became shorter, broader, more robust. Defensive lines angled and folded, creating kill zones and ricochet paths for incoming shot. These changes weren't mistakes. They were the first step towards a new age of fortification, an age where the medieval castle, with its proud towers and soaring battlements, would gradually evolve into the low, geometric artillery fortresses of the Renaissance. Gunpowder didn't just damage walls, it rewrote the entire philosophy of defense, and with each thunderous blast, the medieval world in stone quietly gave way to the modern world of fire and iron. Direct assaults were incredibly dangerous, but they did happen. Scaling ladders were one of the oldest and simplest methods of assault, and also one of the deadliest. Soldiers had to run directly toward the wall under a hail of arrows, rocks, crossbow bolts, and boiling water. If they managed to plant the ladder at the base of the wall, the real nightmare began. Climbing, exposed, while defenders hacked at the ladder or shoved it away with poles. Yet, despite the danger, ladders were incredibly useful. They were fast to build, easy to transport, and perfect for overwhelming a small garrison with sheer numbers. Many armies used them as diversionary tactics, sending waves of troops up ladders simply to distract defenders, while sappers dug mines or engineers pushed siege towers elsewhere. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders famously used ladders in coordinated assaults on multiple fronts, using the defenders to spread themselves thin. It didn't win the siege outright, but it helped create the chaos and pressure that ultimately led to the walls being breached. Storming the main gate was the most direct and dramatic form of assault, and usually the bloodiest. Even after attackers smashed through the outer doors or created a breach with rams or fire, they still had to fight their way into the gatehouse itself, a confined space specifically designed to be a killing zone. Defenders could fire through murder holes above, stab through side ports, and drop rocks, sand, or burning material into the mass of attackers below. Meanwhile, attackers tried to force open the inner gate, or wedge themselves into passages to stop it from being closed again. Hand-to-hand combat in these tight corridors was brutal, chaotic, and often decided by inches. A successful storming of the gate usually happened only after defenders were exhausted or distracted, or when a breach elsewhere had already weakened their resolve. Night assaults were rare in medieval siege warfare, not because they were ineffective, but because they were incredibly risky. Coordinating troops in darkness was nearly impossible, and any misstep could cause panic, confusion, and friendly casualties. Yet, when they worked, they offered a powerful advantage: surprise. In 1373, Night Escalade of Cassena showed just how effective a well-planned assault could be, as attackers used darkness to mask their movements and scale the walls before defenders fully realized what was happening. And in 1204 at Chateau Galad, a small French infiltration unit used the early morning gloom to slip through a latrine chute, yes, literally, gaining access to the inner bailey and triggering the collapse of the fortress defense. Night attacks were gambles, costly if they failed, devastating if they succeeded. Now let's turn our attention to some real historic sieges. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 AD, during the First Crusade, is one of the most dramatic and brutal assaults in medieval history. The city was protected by strong stone walls, towers, and steep slopes that made direct attack nearly impossible. But the Crusaders, desperate and starving, constructed giant siege towers from dismantled local ships and timber scavenged from miles around. On the 15th of July, 1099, they rolled 2 towers forward under a hail of arrows and Greek fire. After a night of repositioning one tower in secrecy, the Crusaders launched a coordinated assault at dawn. When Godfrey of Bouillon's tower reached the top of the wall, his men dropped the drawbridge and stormed across, overwhelming the defenders. Jerusalem fell after only a few hours of hand-to-hand combat inside the gates. It's a textbook example of siege towers, sapping, naval timber, and psychological warfare coming together in one desperate final push. The Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 is the siege that medieval chronicles never forget. King John faced rebel barons who held the castle against him. Rochester had enormous curtain walls and a massive stone keep, but John knew a secret. If the wall is too strong to break, go under it. Royal engineers dug a mine beneath the keep's southeast tower, propped it up with wooden beams, then set the supports on fire using the fat of 40 slaughtered pigs. The burning timbers collapsed, The tunnel caved in, and an entire corner of the keep came crashing down. Even then, the rebels fought on inside the remaining half of the tower for weeks. It remains one of the best examples of medieval mining and counter-mining ever recorded. In 1216, Dover Castle, often called the Lock and Key of the kingdom, faced a massive French army during the First Barons' War. The garrison was tiny, only about 140 knights and a few hundred men, but Dover's layered defences were among the most advanced in Europe. Moats, gatehouses, tunnels and inner baileys. The French used mangonels, scaling ladders, rams and repeated assaults, but strong defensive design meant every outer layer forced them into a deadly bottleneck. In one famous instance, French troops stormed the tower only to find themselves trapped inside when the English sealed the doors and attacked them from below. Dover held for months and never fell. It is the ultimate demonstration of concentric castle design working exactly as intended. The 6-month siege of Kenilworth in 1266 remains the longest in English medieval history. The defenders were protected not just by walls but by an enormous artificial lake, an early example of water-based defence at scale. The royal forces deployed siege towers, catapults, barges, and a massive trebuchet nicknamed the Bear Fry. Even so, the defenders resisted every attack, living off stores of grain and fish from the Mere. Starvation eventually forced surrender, but only after half a year of non-stop siegecraft. The more logistically complex English siege ever recorded. When Edward I besieged Stirling Castle, he brought the full weight of English engineering with him. Trebuchets, rams, catapults and siege towers all played a role, but what made this siege famous was Warwolf, the largest trebuchet ever built in medieval Europe. It supposedly took 5 master carpenters and 30 labourers at least 3 months to assemble. Legend says the defenders tried to surrender before Warwolf was fired, and Edward refused. He wanted to test his new machine. When Warwolf finally launched, it smashed the gatehouse and shattered the defenders' morale. Stirling surrendered soon after. With the siege of Orleans in 1428 to 1429, the English believed Orleans would be the decisive blow that ended French resistance in the 100 Years' War. Their siege lines gradually tightened around the city, relying on fortified positions called bastilles rather than a full encirclement. Orleans held out for months, but morale collapsed, until Joan of Arc arrived. Her presence revitalized the defenders, who launched coordinated assaults on English bastilles. In just over a week, the siege was broken. It marked the first major French victory in decades and became a turning point in the war, proving that medieval sieges were not just tests of engineering, but of leadership, morale, and political will. Though outside of Western Europe, the 1453 siege of Constantinople is essential for understanding how medieval sieges reached their technological peak and end. Mehmed II deployed massive bombards, including the famous Basilica, capable of firing stone balls weighing over half a ton. Gunpowder artillery rendered many medieval walls obsolete, and the 53-day siege used everything from trenches, cannon, naval blockades, ladders, towers, mines, and countermines. On the 29th of May 1453, the Ottomans breached the Theodosian walls, fortifications that had stood for 1,000 years. This moment signalled the end of the medieval era of castle warfare. No stone wall, no matter how thick, could withstand sustained cannon fire forever. Across the medieval world, castles stood as far more than stone silhouettes on the horizon. They were the beating hearts of power, the places where justice was handed down, taxes were raised, alliances were forged, and entire regions were governed. A fortress was a statement of wealth, of legitimacy, and of a ruler's grip over the land. But behind the banners and ceremony lay something far more formidable. Every arc, every tower, every arrow slice was engineered with ruthless precision. Castles were machines built for war, meticulously crafted to slow, scatter, and bleed the armies that dared to challenge them. Spiral staircases that favoured defenders, gatehouses designed as death traps, layered baileys, kill zones, choke points, and murder holes. Nothing was accidental. And when war finally came, it was siege warfare, not open battle, that decided the fate of kingdoms. Inside the walls, garrisons endured hunger, exhaustion, fire, and the thunder of siege engines. Outside, armies raised wooden towers, hurled stones the size of millstones, mined tunnels underneath the foundations, or starved a fortress into grim surrender. Siege by siege, decade after decade, castles shaped the rhythm and realities of medieval conflict. For over 500 years, they dictated strategy, controlled borders, protected trade routes, and projected royal authority. Castles were at once homes, courts, weapons, and political theatre. Symbols carved into the landscape to remind everyone who truly ruled. And although gunpowder would eventually change the art of war forever, the legacy of the medieval castle remains, not just in ruins and reconstructions, but in the remarkable ingenuity, resilience, and sheer will that went into building and defending these extraordinary machines of stone. Thank you for joining me on this episode of A Long Look. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to let me know in the comments below. And join me next time on A Long Look. Take care.